At last I glanced up, biting my lower lip. I could feel my own face hardening with hopeless anger. But Tsubaki was again gazing out the window, and his countenance seemed to have aged, grown more haggard with each passing minute. "Mere boys and all that fire coming up," he repeated. "And I have to send them." I waited, felt the growing sense of expectation, inevitability. "Corporal Kuwahara?" "Yes, Honourable Captain." "You have seen a lot of war this past year, much sorrow, much death and destruction, experienced more than 1,000,000 other men will experience in 1,000,000 years." I waited. Tsubaki sighed. "Of course we could have sent you long ago, but you have an excellent record. You have been of great value to your country." "Thank you, Honourable Captain," I said, scarcely able to hear my own words. "It is only a small and humble effort." "No!" Tsubaki insisted. "It is far more than that." The sound of motors was expanding now. "But at last the time has come." I nodded, head bowed, the motors ever louder, the locust-like ringing in my ears suddenly exploding in volume. "I would change it if I could, Corporal Kuwahara. Believe me, I would change the entire world. But I am only the commander of a doomed squadron, what little remains. Now, however, the end has come. For everyone left." My hands were shaking. The muscles were twitching in my arms and legs, my heart lurching. I closed my eyes, waiting, and the words came. "Are you prepared?" As though listening to a recording, I heard my own reply, virtually inaudible through all the roaring and ringing. "Yes, Honourable Captain, I am honoured to be deemed worthy. I wish to go as soon as possible." Again Tsubaki sighed. "That is commendable. You will return to Hiro within the hour." Within the hour. Incredible. "Your orders will come within a week or two." "Hiro?" I glanced at him in surprise. "Yes, part of it has been restored." Tsubaki stood, unwilling now to look at me, and I also arose. The room was slowly churning. I was very dizzy. "Sayonara, Corporal Kuwahara." "Sayonara, Honourable Captain." Seconds later I was headed for my quarters to pack my belongings. The military never allowed a man to stay in one spot very long, never a place he could call home. Always juggling men around like spare parts. I passed the barracks where Nakamura had lived, then further on, the one for Tatsuno. Stayed but not stayed, lived but not lived, gone yet not gone. They could not be gone. They had to be somewhere, like the wind. Yet only their belongings remained and had probably been sent to their families by now. Then a disconcerting thought struck me. What had become of Tatsuno's little finger? He had entrusted it to my care, and somehow amid all the chaos I had almost forgotten about it. Dismayed, I altered my course, heading for my Hayabusa. Simultaneously, visions of Toyoko surfaced in my mind for the 100th time, alternately bright and vibrant, then like wraiths fading within the mist. My eyes blurred, and I clenched my teeth. All these stupid tears, this craven bawling. I was compromising myself badly, failing to be a man. My time had come at last, only a matter of days. Then no more worries. I trudged blindly onward, my soul greyer than the concrete. But why should I be any different than the rest, I wondered. Why should Kuwahara be exempted when thousands of others were called upon to make the great sacrifice? Why Tatsuno and Nakamura? Okai and Yamamoto, but not Kuwahara. I was expendable like all the rest. In the end, were we not all expendable? All of mankind? It was only a matter of time for everyone. Be resolved that honour is heavier than the mountains, while death is lighter than a feather. Yes, lighter than a feather, and that I would cling to. Ahead was my Hayabusa, waiting stoically. My salvation, my companion in death, waiting so steadfastly, so patiently, so faithfully. In moments we would ascend skyward together once more and return to Hiro, our source of origin. Because aircraft were now so scarce, we would probably remain together as always. Companions unto the end. The thought gave me a little comfort. Upon nearing my plane, I encountered a bomber pilot named Takahashi, whom I had known casually at Hiro. He had just finished going over his aircraft with two of our mechanics. I waved and he grinned. "Checking it out?" I called. An elaborate shrug. "Right, but who knows why? Haven't dropped a bomb in the past month." Then he regarded me more seriously. "Taking off?" I nodded. "Hi, in about an hour. Back to Hiro." For a second I paused, reflecting. "Still going to the Tokiwaya?" "Right." He held up his thumb, grinning. "Good duty." "You remember that girl I've been going with? Toyoko Akimoto?" The grin widened. "Hi, who doesn't?" I hesitated. "Well, she thinks I'm—" Suddenly I was feeling foolish, humiliated. "She probably doesn't know I made it back from Okinawa." He watched me expectantly. "You want me to tell her anything?" For a moment I wavered, riddled with indecision. What could he tell her? That I was scheduled to die? No, I'd have to decide what to do once I was back at Hiro. Maybe get her a message some way, or maybe just... He was watching me curiously, waiting. "Tell her I'm still alive, that they shipped me back to Hiro the minute I got here." Again I hesitated. "Tell her I'll contact her before long, if they'll let me." Takahashi nodded, his face turning sober, and tossed me a half-wave, half-salute. "All right, Yasbe. Good luck." I smiled. He had called me Yasbe, probably the only person left who would ever honor me that way. "Thanks, Takahashi," I answered. "Same to you. Be sure to tell her." "Right, definitely. I'll be sure to." What I wanted to say was, tell her that I miss her desperately, that I love her beyond belief. But that would have to come later, if it ever came at all. A minute or two afterward, I climbed into my fighter. Yes, to my relief, Tatsuno's finger was still there, wrapped in a handkerchief beneath the control panel, blackened and shriveled, beginning to smell of decay, but I would see at all costs that it reached his family. Slowly I left the cockpit, sliding languidly off the wing, and planted my feet on the concrete runway. Simultaneously, a strange thing happened. A tiny grey feather came lilting and tumbling toward me across the concrete, probably from one of the numerous pigeons that frequented the area. It caught in a rough spot almost at my feet, quivering impulsively in the breeze as though blessed with a life of its own. For a time I watched, wondering how far it might journey. To what distant place? Suddenly, on impulse, I stooped and picked it up. "Ah, Yasbe, Yasbe! How crazy you are!" Crazy, yes, but I put the feather in my pocket. Chapter 27. Battle with the Giants. Hiro. Hiro again. I had been away only 2 months, but it might as well have been 2 years. What was time? Something I would never comprehend. I merely knew that nothing was more relentless. Nothing was as relentless as time or as constant as change. And Hiro had indeed changed drastically. Despite efforts at reconstruction, the base was badly ravaged. The main hangar and several of the barracks were charred ruins. Part of the airfield had been bombed so heavily it was for the present beyond repair. Tumbled patches of concrete, craters 6 to 8 feet deep. Even the water tower was gone, the tower from which one of our trainees had leapt to his death in days gone by. Where Hiro obtained its water now I did not know. The barracks from my fighter training was gone, burned to ashes, but the one from basic remained, and after reporting to the orderly room I paid it a visit. Empty now. Wandering its length, I realized that time was relative, even to the dust. The dust of centuries lay upon the empty bed springs, upon the lockers, and across the floor. Few things are more empty, more lonely than a moribund military installation. Yet now, ironically, I felt twinges of nostalgia. Nostalgia for the trials of basic training? Ridiculous, yet in a way I even missed the pig and his henchman the snake. Standing there alone, I wondered what had become of them. No signs of basic training whatever now, so perhaps they had been assigned elsewhere. Perhaps they had been killed in the bombing. The thought afforded no satisfaction, only more emptiness. I walked the length of the barracks very slowly, staring down at my feet, each step leaving its imprint in the dust. Where had all that dust come from? Glancing about, I saw a dozen shattered windows and immediately had my answer. Great clouds of it from all the bombing. The entire base was covered with it. Approaching the rear door, I spotted 2 ball bats leaning there to my left in the corner of the room. I shook my head, felt my lips forming a wan smile. Of course, the wonderful ball bats. Hefting one, I felt its smoothness, blew away the dust and gave a violent, echoing sneeze. But no one was there to hear, only the pervasive quality of absence. Through watering eyes, I read the familiar inscription, Yamato Damashi Seishinbo, a ball bat for instilling the fighting spirit, the spirit of Yamato. So there was little to do now, but wait, merely exist while the days expired. A few of our fighter pilots were filtering back to the base now, most of whom I had known in passing at Oita, all like myself awaiting the final word. In consequence, we were placed on alert, restricted to the base, and time languished in the mounting heat of July, stifling us in its vapour. In the midst of it all, I returned to the abandoned barracks, sat down on the back steps, and wrote a letter. Dear Toyoko. For a long time I sat there, my pen suspended as though the very ink were full of indecision. I am still among the living, waiting for my orders that may come any day, any hour, yet even so. Again I hesitated, fraught with uncertainty. I still cling to your words the last time we were together. Remember? You said that the war would end in time. You said that something strange and unexpected would happen. What that might be, I have no idea, and don't suppose you do either. Perhaps no one does. In any event, it must come soon, or I will be gone along with nearly everyone remaining here. My hand began to tremble, the words becoming wavery. But always remember, Toyoko. My throat was tightening badly, as though I had swallowed a handful of the dust all around me. My eyes watered, and my body shook with a strange, shuddering gasp. That whatever happens, I will always love you. I will always be here somewhere, like the wind among the lanterns. For a long time I wept silently, making no effort to control my shaking. The final words were badly scrawled, and the page was becoming damp. Perhaps some night I will come to ring the chimes on your balcony. I pray that you will remember me when you hear them ringing, and when you hear waves along the shore. Most of all, I pray that you are safe and well. I pray for your eternal happiness. That afternoon I mailed the letter, not knowing whether it would ever leave the base post office, or if so, whether mail was even being delivered at Oita. Yet somehow, in some slight way, putting those words on paper helped. And somehow, also, those final days squirmed by. Each bleak hour expired, leaving its faint and fetid aftermath, dissolving at times in the fiery breath of an occasional air battle. We almost welcomed them now, anything to relieve the curse of waiting, and we fought with great abandon, caring little whether we lived or died. Life assumes a different perspective when only a little remains, yet ironically, our very daring seemed to preserve us. 2 of us downed an enemy fighter in a surprise attack near Kure one day, then fled almost before the Americans knew what had happened. As our victim plummeted toward the bay, I decided that my only answer was to hurl fear to the winds. Do not be afraid. There is nothing to lose. It gave one a special magic. Strike the enemy hard and fast before he strikes you, then vanish. Yes, now that there was no hope, it was easy to attack fearlessly. I knew how to use the clouds and the sun. They were my friends. The enemy could send 1,000 planes, no matter. We would somehow be there, a dwindling few, to slash at their tails and send them on their way to hell. A week passed. 2 weeks. Incredibly, nearly a month. It was now almost August, and I was still awaiting my summons, day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute. How does one exist under such circumstances? He exists because he exists. There is no alternative but death, by one's own hand or otherwise. Throughout it all, however, was the faint, pale hope that the war would end. It seemed increasingly obvious that the sun was setting. No longer was the Nippon Empire the land of the rising sun. And still as well I clung to Toyoko's promise. The war will end. The war will end in time. What a bizarre kind of race, my own doom running neck and neck with the doom of my country. What endless feelings of ambivalence. And yet, again increasingly I reflected upon the words of Nomoto's mother. Listen to me, my sons. There is no honour in dying for a lost cause. Nor was there any advantage. What, in practical reality, could be accomplished now, even if every last remaining one of us, by some absurd quirk of fate, sank an enemy ship? They were limitless, implacable. More and more now, my bitterness toward our obstinate, idiotic leaders in Tokyo transcended my hatred for the enemy. Nevertheless, we fought on. Near the end of July, we learned that a force of B29s was flying southwest of Osaka, probably slated to pummel that city, then split, striking Matsue and Okayama. Only 4 of us, a Lieutenant Shoji Matu, Sergeant, another corporal, and I, were sent forth to meet them above Okayama. A pitiful few, another telling evidence that Japan was breathing her death rattles. Even so, we had covenanted together just before takeoff. Today we would send one of those thunderous super-fortresses to its death. Having calculated the time of our encounter with the 29s, I did some additional planning. Our flight would carry us over Onomichi, my very home. Why not stage a brief aerobatic performance for the students at Onomichi High School, perhaps even for my own family and neighbours? It seemed a fine idea, and my 3 companions were all enthusiastic. Shortly before takeoff, I sat down to write a brief message, merely a few words of devotion to my family. Merely a few words because I had only seconds and didn't know what to say. What could I tell them? That I would soon be receiving my final orders? No sense in it. None at all. They would find out soon enough. Still, I had to leave them something. It was apparent from their letters that most of my own were not being delivered, nor had I received much word from them in some time. After pondering the matter briefly, I scribbled down a few words, telling them that I was again at Hiro, that I was well, that I hoped and prayed they were. Simultaneously, I almost wondered whether my family still existed, whether they ever had. The aura of unreality was steadily growing more powerful. Lately, in fact, there had been disquieting moments when I could no longer conjure up their images. I was literally forgetting what they looked like. I rolled the message up and placed it in a metal tube to which I had attached a long white streamer. It was essential that the descent be clearly visible, that someone find it and make the delivery according to the enclosed instructions. Minutes after leaving the landing field, I was gazing down upon familiar territory, the shipyards, the shoreline where the fishermen dwelt, the main buildings of town, those that remained. Many of them had been demolished, but the radio station was still standing along, as I had devoutly hoped, with my high school. My own home neighbourhood, secluded within the Senkoji Mountains, still appeared to be intact as well. A group of students on the school athletic field gazed up as we began our descent. Plummeting down, my companions close behind, I could see their upturned faces. Seconds later, however, I glanced back, steeply climbing, and was astonished to see them scattering for cover. Shaking my head, I grinned, even laughed. "Green, kids!" The lieutenant's voice crackled over my intercom. Don't even know their own planes." "Act like they've never even seen them before," I fired back, then grew more serious. Very probably they had not seen any, not for a long time. Soon, though, they emerged from hiding and were beginning to wave. I could see their faces clearly, practically hear their cries. With only seconds to spare, we plunged at them, spiralling crazily, pulling out at treetop level, rocking the buildings with our thunder. On our third and final pass, we arched over the field, banking hard to avoid the encircling mountains. Students had flooded from every exit and were waving joyfully. Angling low, I released my message, saw it fluttering earthward. People were even appearing from some of the houses now, but as I passed over my own, there was no sign of life, and in seconds the city was falling behind, fading, gone. What a peculiar sensation. Everything, my home included, had looked so different from the air. Once more, Onomichi was only a fond illusion. I had not returned home after all. Soaring onward toward our special rendezvous, I wondered what would become of my people, those innocent young girls. How many of them, of our women, would the enemy use according to its whims? A vanquished nation is a plundered nation, spared no cruelty or humiliation. Well, regardless of what might come, today the enemy would feel our sting. Not long afterward we neared Okayama, and soon, exactly as calculated, the B29s appeared, only 6 of them, but ominous nonetheless, forging their way eastward at 15,000 feet, flanked by a dozen Hellcats. The 29s were indeed awesome, considerably larger and more formidable than the 17s we had encountered earlier in the war. 6 of them, lethal leviathans trailing vapour against a purple sky. Our lieutenant signalled, and I felt my mouth tighten, the upper lip puffing with air, as we climbed and circled to their rear. At the moment, our enemy was apparently unaware of us. The Japanese Army Air Force, once a formidable power, was now only a mockery, and the 29s lumbered ponderously onward, relentlessly, utterly remorseless. The Americans simply kept coming and coming, more and more and more, ever growing in numbers and size. Only when we plummeted downward from the sun were they aware of us. Lining up the rear fortress in my rangefinder, I began firing, and it swiftly retaliated with a vicious barrage of its own. Others were opening fire as well, and the Hellcats swarmed into action, intent on living up to their name. Roaring downward behind our lieutenant, I saw the tracers racing toward and past us, all in an instant, all very near. Saw them striking home. The lieutenant's plane seemed to shudder momentarily like someone taking a savage body blow. Then, casting off streamers of smoke and flame, it persisted. Portions of the fuselage were ripping apart, but miraculously he continued, slicing directly through the tail section of the lead bomber and exploding. Helplessly maimed, the B-29 spiraled downward in monstrous and moaning, ever-widening gyrations, its severed tail dropping vertically after the blackened and fading remains of Shojimata. Almost simultaneously, I levered back on the stick, pulling out of my dive at more than 5 Gs, wavering, nearly tearing my wings off. For several seconds the blood drained from my head, and by the time I had recovered, the remaining bombers had surged onward, fanning and swerving to avoid the fate of their leader. So suddenly, both our lieutenant and the B-29, gone. Incredulous, I followed the rapidly vanishing enemy, gradually climbing as I gained on them. The huge bombers were remarkably swift, and it required 2 or 3 minutes for me to close the gap. As I moved in on the trailing bomber, it began to zigzag erratically, opening up with its tail guns, and the Hellcats were circling ravenously, coming at me from almost every direction. I was only 200 yards above the elusive 29 now, and about that far behind. Time for the attack, and I angled into a steep dive, charging at him full bore, pivoting on my axis, aileron rolling down at well over 400 miles an hour. The 29's turret guns, both front and rear, were opening up now. I had completed my final roll, too late to worry about being elusive. airspeed approaching 500, firing attenuated bursts directly at its nose area. Now the enemy was looming, larger than life, disgorging a withering barrage, graphing the air all about me with the sinister red lines. But I was flying as never before, undeterred, and the monster veered off even more sharply, undoubtedly expecting to be rammed. I watched my own tracers arch, seeming to curve, stitching their seam backward along his wing and fuselage. Making contact. The B29 was coughing smoke, and I felt a diabolical surge of elation. Triumph, revenge. Now it was rapidly losing altitude, but still deadly. As I screamed past its massive rudder, the tailguns were ripping away without compromise, the hot lead ravaging my wings and fuselage. Yes, the familiar, ominous sledgehammer sounds, and a Hellcat was firing away at me from the rear. 2 others were charging in from the side. Pulling out radically, I hit the stick and rudder pedal, swerving left and climbing. Only one of the Grummans was still with me at this point. Trailing the others, he had anticipated me. I was circling hard, still bidding for altitude, and upon completing a full 360 degrees, I glanced back over my shoulder. The enemy was still there, slightly above, determined to cut inside my arc, banking so closely that I could distinctly see the pilot. The sun was glinting on his goggles, his white teeth bared in a triumphant grin. A confident American, an expression I will never forget, for suddenly I was terribly afraid as never before, my veins filling with ice crystals. Not so much fear for myself, actually, as for another reason. Somehow that expression, that mere single glimpse, symbolized the hopelessness of our plight as nothing else ever had. The contest was over, and I dropped away radically, barrel rolling, plunging straight downward for thousands of feet as I had done the month before over Okinawa. 2 of the enemy, apparently pursuing my comrades, fanned off startled as I thundered by, missing one of them by only a few yards. Down, 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 spinning, at last dropping straight, pulling out perilously near the earth, fighting off the blackness. Escape once more, and I was gunning homeward at full throttle. Momentarily, despite all, I rejoiced in our good fortune. In addition to the 29 destroyed by our lieutenant, a second had also gone down. How I wanted to claim that monster for my own, to see it hit the water. Undoubtedly it was the bomber with which I had done battle. I had not witnessed its actual demise, however, nor had others been on hand to verify what occurred. Later I learned that a B-29 had crashed near Okayama, its crew bailing out over the inland sea. Chapter 28. Hiroshima. It was August 1st, 1945, and I had returned from a reconnaissance flight near Matsue to learn that someone had paid me a visit. "Some woman was here to see you, Kuwahara," the desk sergeant said. My heart surged, beating rapidly. "Toyoko?" "Your sister," the clerk added. Well then, my sister. Wonderful. Surely I wanted to see her as well. "Unfortunately, we couldn't allow her to stay," the desk sergeant continued. "As you know, we can't have any civilians on the base now." I barely nodded. "She left you these," he said. Thanking him, I hurried to my barracks, carrying the envelope and tiny parcel. Sitting on my cot, I opened the note and began reading. "Yasuo-chan, we received your message and were overjoyed to hear from you, the first word in many weeks. We did not know what had become of you, but now to learn that you are near us once more, that makes us feel so much better, even though we cannot see you. How proud we are, Yasuo. We know that you are bringing great honor to the Emperor, your country and your family. I love you for this, my brother, for your courage, but always, even more for what you have been to me, what we have been to each other. I speak now as well for our entire family. Wherever you may go, whatever you may be doing, our love journeys with you. Each day I pray for you at our shrine and always in my heart. Your sister, Tomika." Over and over I read those words, consumed by emotion. An immense longing swept over me like a tide. If only I could have seen her, for a single, fleeting second, just one more time. Then the tide ebbed. No, better not to have seen her at all, not to see any of them. Better that way. At last I opened the little parcel. For a long time I sat there bowed, staring at her gift, feeling its softness against my palm, gazing at its lustrous darkness. Tomika had left me a lock of her hair. A torpid August first merged with August 2nd, over a month since my meeting with Captain Tsubaki. A month and still waiting. Incredible. Why didn't the word come? Why? What were they waiting for? And now the paradox loomed even more strangely. As each day brought me closer to death, it might also draw me farther away. It was a race between the death of our nation and the death of Yasuo Kuwahara. The night of August 3rd, I tossed feverishly, beset by endless nightmares. Death was no longer my greatest fear. Waiting itself was worse. No hope now. Desperate though our country had become, I decided that its surrender might still take months. The waiting, the abominable waiting, the strangling noose of uncertainty growing ever tighter. Once I awakened, muttering incoherently, my entire body slick with sweat, my hair not only damp but even wet with it. If my orders didn't come soon, I might take the easy way out after all. A sharp knife, a quick slice across the jugular vein. "There is nothing honourable in dying for a lost cause," the words came. "There is nothing." I almost choked. I was ensnared in the great net from which there was no escape. One way or another I would die. But die the easy way to escape the hard way. After all the struggle, end my life through cowardice, humiliation and dishonour. Yes, humiliation and dishonour, to myself and to my family, if not for our government for which I had now lost all respect. I shook my head, sighing, moaning. No, not the easy way, not the coward's way. Wait, Kuwahara, wait, barely existing from one moment to the next. Grit your teeth, clench your fists, swear, pray to God, curse him if you have to, but wait. Do not bring dishonour. Keep me sane, keep me in the skies, striking at the enemy, until the word comes. Yes, fighting is the best solution now, my only salvation. August 4th, I found myself praying many times that day, much of it virtually senseless, often utterly contradictory. I knew where a sharp knife was, waiting patiently without compromise. God, send me an enemy plane. Don't make me wait. Do not leave me here. At 4 a.m, August 5th, I sat bolt upright, tearing myself from the ragged fracture of another nightmare. My mattress was again saturated with sweat, and I arose shakily to begin pacing the floor. I was seeing it all from a different perspective again. What did it matter how I died, just so I got it over with? My family? I didn't have a family. My entire past was a dream. Life itself the constant nightmare, inescapable, awake or asleep. The wooden floor was hard and a bit slivery as I crossed it and exited through the back door. Cooler outside, the base silent and corpse-like, slowly wreathing in darkness and the first bilious gleams of dawn. In a few minutes I would go get the knife, kneel there beside the barracks, dark and cool. Enter the waning darkness, the coolness, before they escaped, flee with them forever. No, ridiculous. Not after so long a struggle. For a moment I cursed the entire world, but nothing would send me out a coward. I would have that one cold triumph. Now, go back in and lie down on your soggy mattress. Got to sleep before the feeling changes again. You'll make it to the end, Yazbei. Somehow. Think about anything else. About Toyoko. No, better not. Toyoko makes you remember that final night together. Then think of Tatsuno Nakamura too. You were not a true friend, Kuwahara. Yes, guilt, a rancid taste on the tongue, that only one thing can dispel. Think of someone else. Toyoko. No, not Toyoko, not... Think of your sister, your mother. Ah, yes. You can see their faces once more, hear their blessed voices. An hour before réveillé, I sank into a feverish sleep, a state of near coma. And that day, I received my written orders. On August 8th, I would take off for the final time. At last, I truly knew. A great and leaden door had swung open, revealing my destiny. Okinawa, waiting there amid the endless waters and the swirling vapours of time. 3 days. Somehow, some way, I would cling to the melting rim of existence 3 more days. The following morning, I would be granted a 2-day pass. Such was the Japanese military's magnanimity to its fated sons. At first, I had decided not to use that pass. I had reflected upon the matter lengthily, well beforehand. In fact, convinced that it would be better never to see my family or friends again, told myself that in effect I had died already. I had banished the idea from my mind. Almost. Early that next morning, August 6th, I burst into the orderly room with a frantic change of heart. "My pass! Do you have a 2-day pass for me?" The desk sergeant was owlish, slightly grizzled, wearing thick-lensed reading glasses. For a moment he regarded me strangely. "You were supposed to have signed for it last night, Corporal." "I couldn't last night," I said, struggling hard to contain myself. "Just give me the pass. I'll sign for it now." "Well, all right," he replied, still stupidly reluctant. Let's see." Fumbling his way through the file with infuriating clumsiness. Let's see. Ito, Kimura. Hi, Kuwahara. Go ahead, but date it August 5th, or it will be my ass. No, not there, damn it. Right here, under Kimura's. For a moment, I had scarcely known what I was doing. It was almost as if I had never learned to write. "Arigato, Sergeant. Thank you." With trembling hands, I scrawled my signature, destination, time of departure, time of return, then fled. Minutes later, I had obtained a ride in the back of an army truck headed for Hiroshima. It would not take long to reach my home from there. Home, my place of origin, the people to whom I belonged. I should have known the pull would be too great, inexorable, like the gravitational force of the moon upon the tides. How foolish I had been. The truck rumbled erratically forward, jolting and clattering over the pitted road, nearly jarring my teeth loose at times, but I didn't mind. I was gazing at the darkening green of the rice fields, the narrow canals, the lush green vegetation of the mountains, the interplay of sunlight and retreating shadow, and the burgeoning blue of the sky. Suddenly there was a remarkable enchantment about my entire surroundings, a beauty I had almost forgotten. Nostalgia welled with the advancing light, and now I was remembering experiences from my boyhood. A family visit to the shrines of Kyoto, a secluded lake miraculously high in the mountains somewhere, taking turns with my brothers looking through a pay telescope at scenes far distant. 2 fishermen in a rowboat a mile away, unaware of our gaze as they baited their hooks, then commenced eating their lunch. A bright river of memory flowing through my mind with scenes of enchantment at every turn, but most of all, home. Unexpectedly, I was strangely happy. Miraculously, it suddenly seemed that the next 2 days would somehow be exempt from the manacles of fate just ahead, a golden island that would glow throughout the expanses of eternity. The 48 hours would pass, but the island would remain, and death would merely be a transition, a process of purification wherein the good, the just, the truly happy would abide. Yes, in the last analysis, death would indeed be lighter than a feather. Perhaps God, or Buddha, or fate, someone or something, who or whatever placed us in this strange estate called mortality, would accomplish it. "Make it acceptable to me," I murmured. Please make it all right." The words repeated themselves over and over, resonating throughout my being, and I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, hands clasping my head. That way, I could feel every rock and depression in the road, but it was working. Someone or something was listening. I continued to repeat the words, but more calmly now, and my soul was relaxing as though a clean breeze were drifting through. I glanced up. Yes, a cleansing breeze, literally. The rice was billowing in soft green waves, and yes, the happiness had not deserted me. 2 golden days, and that was everything. I left the truck on the outskirts of Hiroshima at about 7:30 a.m., and a few minutes later boarded a streetcar. Impulsively, only moments earlier, I had decided to visit briefly with a friend there in the 2nd General Army Hospital before going on to Onomichi. Leaving the streetcar, I heard it move off along the tracks, emitting a lonely tootle in the distance. For an instant I gazed about, filled with a sudden need to consume, somehow digest and metabolize my entire surroundings. The sky was still clear, except for a muted overcast in the west as I walked along Shiratori Street toward the hospital. Already it was growing sultry, and even at that hour small bands of children were skittering about the streets, blessedly unaware that their world was falling apart. "Ohayo gozaimasu," a man passed by, carrying a briefcase, and I returned his good morning. Grocers and magazine vendors had opened the shutters to their flimsy huts, but there was little within them of interest. Once, on impulse though, I stopped to purchase an orange. I could feel its roundness as I continued along the street, the gratifying texture of its skin, even the pores in my hand. What a marvellous creation! How remarkably designed! By chance alone? If so, why the consistency in oranges everywhere, the order of their growth? The pliable, rubbery skin, so easily removable yet so remarkably protective? Why the delightful, incredibly sweet, easily separable sections, perfectly constituted to delight the palate and enhance one's health? The skin glowed entrancingly, joyfully. My mouth watered, but I would wait, cherishing it until the proper time. A reward, a gift to myself. For what, I did not know. Perhaps for having simply survived so long, so miraculously. Along my way, an old woman called to me. Her face was a mosaic of wrinkles and lines, as though it had been frozen and shattered. Eyeing her curiously, I turned back, and she reached for me with a trembling hand. For a moment, I gazed into her withered face, into eyes still bright and alert. "I want to know the truth, young man," she rasped. "What has become of our aircraft? Why are they no longer up there?" She hunched before me, shriveled, blinking and stoic, probably anticipating the worst, even wanting it. Gently I laid my hand upon her shoulder and gazed at the pavement. I wished greatly that I could go somewhere with that ancient Obasan. Conversation would be unnecessary, only her presence. That, perhaps, and a cup of tea. "Old mother," I said, "there are few planes left. Before long it will all be over, and we won't have to hide from the bombs any more." Her claw closed upon my hand almost painfully, and I began to leave. Then I turned back for a moment. "Here, take this," I said, and handed her the orange. Minutes later I heard air raid sirens, a small concern, since 2 American planes had already passed over while I was on the streetcar. The lone B29 above did not seem threatening for some reason, merely patronizing. If I were up there now in my Hayabusa, I would dive at it from the eye of the sun, all guns blazing, pumping them out from my cannons. But the old woman was right. No Japanese planes in sight. The sky was empty except for that single, stolid, lumbering monster, coursing the heavens with total impunity. I continued to watch it occasionally, however, as I went along my way. There was something disconcerting in its very placidness, about the persistent smugness of its droning. So casual, so presumptuous. Soon a tiny white speck separated from its silver belly, and the plane moved off, picking up speed. No larger than a marble at first, the object increased to the size of a baseball, then seemed to change in form, becoming a large mushroom. A parachute, carrying a strange, dark object, tapered like a shark but blunt at one end, as though the head had been chopped off. Yes. I heard the speculations of others watching with me. What are they up to now? More of their stupid pamphlets? Yes, more propaganda, more of the same old thing. Don't pay it any... All other mutterings were obliterated, along with everything else. Suddenly a monstrous multicoloured flashbulb went off directly in my face. Something like concentrated heat lightning stifled me, transforming my lungs into vacuums. So fast it might have been a mere figment of the imagination. Yet simultaneously I threw up my hands, vainly striving to protect my face from the ferocious burning. A mighty blast furnace had just been opened upon the world. Within the next moment there came a cataclysm which no one will ever describe adequately. It was neither a roar, a boom, nor a blast. Rather, it was a combination of all those qualities with something else added, the fantastic power of earthquakes, avalanches, and erupting volcanoes. For one fantastic, overwhelming moment, nature had unleashed its wrath, and the world had ruptured in a mighty convulsion. All this within only seconds, and I was slammed to the earth as though struck by a charging rhino. Sudden darkness, all light extinguished like the flicking of a switch. Pressure, an agonized, choking gasp. My body seared with pain. Then relief, utter vacancy. I did not exist, never had. Minutes? Hours? Days? Impossible to tell, but somewhere within the depths of nothingness there came a sound, a rumbling that somehow, in defiance of natural law, restored my spirit in the depths of the void. At the time, however, these things were only dim awareness, the awareness perhaps of a worm stirring in the winter soil or an insect within its cocoon. Another rumbling, then another, and the sense of awareness expanded. Carts. The rumbling of carts. But why? What had happened? Where was I? Gradually my sense of personality acquired clearer dimension. I was Yasuo Kuwahara, corporal. Kuwahara. On my way somewhere. On my way home? Going home to say goodbye. Yes, recollection returning. But what had happened? An earthquake? No, a strange and impossible explosion. A bomb, perhaps, a bomb of colossal force utterly beyond the realm of experience. There within the darkness I saw again the white and welling mushroom, drifting on the retina of memory, steadily transforming now, becoming a gigantic jellyfish. Something dark and sullen, inexpressibly grotesque, attached to its tendrils. But I was Yasuo Kuwahara, still alive, though helpless, scarcely able to move, buried alive. The realization riddled me with horror, greater fear than I had yet known, but eventually I worked one arm free from the rubble embracing it, feeling the skin of my hand rip on something jagged. My eyes, nose, ears, even my mouth were clogged with dirt, and for several minutes I choked and spat, blinking frantically, then stopped suddenly from pain as the grit rasped my eyeballs. For a long time I simply lay there, gasping and groaning. My eyes were watering copiously, but eventually they cleared enough that I could detect a tiny scratch of light overhead. It seemed now that I could hear more sounds above as well, people treading about, once another rumbling noise. Again it died, and I was filled with terror, buried alive. I began to writhe, groping about with my free hand and encountering the jagged board that had ripped it earlier. "Help! Help me!" I forced out the words with all my strength, but they sounded like the croaks of a frog. Again and again I called out, gradually, with greater volume, also growing pain in my throat and chest. The pressure from my waist down was also increasing, becoming unbearable. The numbness was creeping upward, entering my torso. Hours seemed to elapse, and occasionally there were more noises overhead. At times I would call out, then go down in a swoon. It was that whirlpool again that I had discovered months before during my beatings from the mantis. Once I surfaced, and for the moment my thoughts were lucid. A huge and terrible bomb, yes. The Americans had dropped a new bomb unlike any the world had ever known. Yes, that had to be it. During my flights to Okinawa some weeks earlier, I had heard occasional radio messages from the enemy in Saipan, warning us to surrender or suffer catastrophic consequences. Was this the ultimate realization? What an ironic situation in any event. A suicide pilot, a noble, glorious kamikaze, dying inside the earth only a short distance from his home. For an instant I almost laughed. What an ignominious way to die. On the other hand, why did it matter? Perhaps all of Japan was gone. Had a B29 circled over every major city, releasing a parachute with a bomb. What a thought. No more Japan. Everything gone, in ruins. No, impossible. More noise above, giving me a start. Dust had sifted through the scratch of light overhead. For a moment it widened, then shrank to a mere bird's eye. More dust. The eye closed, and I yelled. Feeling as though my lungs might tear loose, I shouted again and again. No answer. Sobbing for air and groaning, I made a last feeble bid for help. Seconds later the eye blinked once more and became a yawning mouth. "I hear you," a voice came. "Be patient. We're removing the rubble." Wonderful words, yet there in my helplessness I wondered again whether I was now a complete cripple. The numbness in my body was increasing. How long had I been there? Days? Would I be liberated only to die moments later? Or to be hopelessly paralyzed? The sounds above increased. At length, unbelievably, the weight was lifting. Darkness changed to a blinding light. "Are you all right?" a voice inquired. Easy, better not move, better not." But I was moving, getting to my hands and knees. Moving, struggling to rise, somehow regaining my feet, but dizzy, overwhelmingly dizzy. The world teetered in a blur. What a weird, swirling vision. Voices insistently, warning, comforting, making no sense, and I toppled backward, the blood draining from my head, much as though I were completing a power dive in my fighter plane, legs collapsing. Easy. Hands and arms, capturing me, breaking my fall. "We've got you. It's all right. Just lie back for a minute." I gazed up at them in vacuous wonderment. My benefactors were all clad in white. "You'll be all right," a voice said. "Just stay right here until you regain your strength. We have to go now." The thought filled me with panic. "No, wait. Don't go." "We must," the voice drifted. "Hiroshima is in ruins. Everyone dead or dying." The figures were dissolving like ghosts. "No, don't leave me," I pleaded, and broke into a strange, dry crying. But the crying hurt so much I ceased, groping for rationality. Eventually I got to my hands and knees and struggled to my feet again. Still so dizzy I wondered if my ear canals had ruptured. Days later I learned that my benefactors, the figures in white, were patients from the army hospital who had dived beneath their beds when the explosion occurred, barely escaping destruction themselves. I also learned that I had been buried for approximately 6 hours. Gradually, my vision cleared, revealing a spectacle exceeding my most horrifying nightmares. So hideous, my already queasy stomach erupted, and I fell to my knees, retching. Minutes later I was still on all fours, hoping that I had merely been the victim of some gargantuan hallucination. But no, it was all there, far more horrible, in fact, than I had initially realized. Many have sought to describe Hiroshima following the nuclear holocaust on that fateful day, August 6, 1945, an immense wound in the heart of history that has never fully healed, merely become a throbbing mass of scar tissue. No one has ever succeeded, nor will they. For what occurred there was beyond the realm of human experience. Certain broad pictures remain, however, scorched forever within my memory. Pictures of a great city reduced to a fiery rubble pit in which approximately 140,000 people had died with an equal number wounded. Some of the former had literally been vaporized or burned to a crisp, and all of it within a few ticks of a watch. Again I stood, still swaying, staring dementedly, and now I felt moisture. A black rain was settling from a black sky. Again, lapses of memory. Again, for a time, I could not recall when I had come to this place or why. All about me for miles, the landscape had been virtually levelled, yet it was steadily astir with life and death, like the amorphous agitations in a swamp, steadily becoming more appalling as my vision cleared. Shiratori Street, I gradually realized, was buried under houses and buildings, folded and smashed like trampled boxes, much of it charred and blackened, portions aflame, periodically flaring up savagely. Bodies were scattered everywhere, some charred and inert, some barely mobile. In the distance, a few of the sturdiest buildings still stood, grey-black and skeletal, a number listing precariously, ready to collapse. Fire and smoke everywhere, rapidly expanding, and at times the smoke drifted my way, blindingly, chokingly. Groggily I gazed skyward. The sun had been annihilated along with everything else. Despite the hour, night was closing in. I glanced down at the debris nearby and realized that fate had actually worked in my favor. The house under which I was buried had also partially shielded me from the blast. In addition, I had apparently fallen at the base of a large watering trough located against the back wall of the house. The trough, in turn, had helped protect me from the collapsing debris. Sand, mortar, and litter had nearly filled the trough, forcing it to overflow, and apparently the remaining water had completely evaporated. The awful heat wave had turned nearby grass and other vegetation to ashes, actually melted much of it. Examining myself more thoroughly now, I discovered a large bruise on the back of my head, lacerations across the side of my face and neck. Both eyes were badly swollen, flowing with tears, and still smarted. My clothing was torn and filthy, with a large rip over my knee. The knee throbbed, sticky with blood and dirt. Eventually I hobbled away aimlessly, reeling at times like a drunk, and within a short distance encountered a pile of bodies, possibly 10 or 12 of them. Several were still alive, struggling feebly to extricate themselves. A blackened form rolled from the heap, and a head emerged. The face was singed beef, and its single bloodshot eye blinked at me. The nose was gone, the mouth a lopsided hole. "Here, here, let me help you," I said, and began dragging free some of the corpses. Tugging at a charred arm, I fell backward. The flesh from the elbow down had sloughed off in my hands like that of a roasted goose. Gorge rising, I continued my task, freeing a man already more dead than alive. 1 or 2 people assisted, but others merely stared as though stupefied. The entire landscape seemed to wreathe with moans and wails, mounting at times to a kind of bedlam. I limped onward, still directionless, and within seconds I chanced upon a man pinned beneath a beam. Several people were grunting and prying with timbers, struggling to extricate him. Then, as they dragged him free, he emitted an agonized scream and died, blood gushing from his bowels. Hip to ankle, he had been mangled, but the beam's pressure had prevented external bleeding. Bewildered, I wandered on while all about me, people were dying, moving aimlessly like half-frozen insects, some clasping their heads other parts of their bodies. Many were naked, and a few, mostly women, sought vainly to cover themselves. Others seemed totally oblivious to their personal nudity. My own clothes were, in fact, more tattered than I had originally realized. One sleeve was missing from my jacket, and one trouser leg, a mere scorched crust, virtually crumbled apart as I brushed against pile of jagged boards. I reeled onward, a wild, staring animal, bereft of my sanity. Oddly, however, a second part of me, a kind of alter ego, seemed to be monitoring my responses, somehow detached from a different perspective. At times it seemed that I could actually stand back a bit to observe the strange, haggard creature that I had become, that others were observing. Observing, however, with utter indifference, for the great majority were in far worse condition than I. A short distance ahead, someone called feebly. A woman sprawled upon the pavement as though hurled from the sky. Her body was roasted, blackened, and blistered beyond recognition. Her hair had been reduced to charcoal, and patches of her skin and flesh were peeling off. One side of her throat was scathed and laid open, yet cauterized by the blast, and I could actually see the blood vessels, weakly pulsating with tortured life. Her lips writhed, struggling to form words, but her vocal cords were also dying. Kneeling beside her, I bent low, listening, heard only the dry, hissing buzz of her breath. Then I understood. "Kill me. Please kill me." Transfixed, I stared at her, my own mouth gaping. The light in those eyes was fading, and suddenly my entire body racked with an immense moan. Clasping my hands to my face, I arose and stumbled off. Innumerable forms lay all about me, some writhing and in their death throes, many afflicted with that same hideous skin condition. Like blackened lepers, they were falling apart. Others simply wandered in collective confusion. Slowly, feeble as an old man, I struggled on throughout the rubble pit that was once Hiroshima for an hour or more, trying at times to be of aid to the wounded and dying, but usually with complete futility. Eventually I found myself before the remains of the Yamanaka Girls' High School. Before classwork that morning, approximately 400 girls had assembled in rows on the outer grounds to receive their daily announcements. The blast had cut them down like an enormous scythe, stripping off everything but their belts. Watches, rings, and buckles had been embedded in their blackened flesh by the fearsome heat. The school pendants worn about their necks were burned into the sternums between their breasts. Parents and other family members were examining the bodies. Mothers and sisters were moaning and wailing unlike anything I have ever heard. Some had apparently identified their own, but the efforts in general were futile because most of the girls' faces had been charred beyond recognition. Teeth projected in ghastly grins, and the odour of their bodies cloyed in my nostrils like the reek of manure and decaying fish. Again I doubled over, holding my stomach and retching, but nothing emerged except for streamers of mucus and saliva flowing from my nostrils and lips, dripping from my chin. As I turned to leave, a man and woman were huddled before a body, peering into the remains of its face with awful intensity. Many were clinging to each other and weeping as though nothing was left in the universe. Eventually I spotted an army truck ahead winnowing its way through an expanse of smouldering rubble. "Wait!" I shouted. "Wait!" But my voice was the cawing of a crow. The truck lumbered onward, 2 or 3 men in the back gaping at me stupidly. "Wait!" The cry tore at my lungs agonizingly, and I stumbled, falling. They could not distinguish me from a civilian, and for a moment I simply sprawled there, face down in the dirt and ashes. Soon another truck came grinding my way, and for a time I thought it might run over me. No matter. A blessing, in fact. Nevertheless, by mere instinct, I raised my hand feebly as it rumbled past. Then, a short distance beyond, it halted and began to back up. For the 3rd time that day, I rose from the earth and, surprised at my own strength, began to run. My energy deserted me as I reached the tailgate, however, and I was dragged aboard like the survivor of a shipwreck. Beyond all feeling now, I stared vacantly at the landscape as it fell behind. Fires still rampaged in many places, smoke stifling the entire area and menacing the sky. We crossed the Otter River upon a bridge miraculously still intact, though precariously near collapse. A human carpet thronged those shores in throbbing blotches. Thousands were sprawled and slowly convulsing along the banks like poisoned lemmings. Countless numbers wallowed in the shallows, trying to cool themselves. Many had died that way, some from their wounds, others from drowning. Bobbing corpses, dozens washing downstream on the current. Mothers, fathers, aged and infant. The bomb had not been guilty of discrimination. Gradually the city fell behind in a ruddy, grit-filled haze, abrading the eyes and nostrils at times like tear gas. Eventually we were passing fields, still green, relatively unchanged, except that the shadows were now lengthening from the west instead of the east. Chapter 29. The Voice of the Emperor. During the following 2 days, I was restricted to my quarters, exhausted and bedfast, yet despite my misery and enervation, I could find no rest. My body was on fire, my eyes constantly smarting and watering. On August 8th, having scarcely slept or eaten, I was detailed to fly a Shinshite, a swift 2-engine reconnaissance plane, over Hiroshima and surrounding area. From 7,000 feet, I peered through my binoculars, down into the city's ravaged heart. Much of it was still burning, and smoke drifted in heavy layers, obscuring large expanses of the area. Everywhere the earth appeared, though, lay havoc, and it was impossible to tell where most of the buildings, even the best known, had stood. Periodically, I detected the bodies of cows and horses, cattle and dogs, along with the mass of human dead. Streetcars had been tossed from their tracks, trains flung from their rails like toys. Flooding the roads in muddy currents were human beings, steadily fleeing toward the mountains and outlying cities, Kaitaichi, Miyajima, and Ujina. Occasionally those rivers formed tributaries as military vehicles forded through, truckloads of soldiers snaking slowly back and forth, evacuating military personnel, fighting fires. What an absurd undertaking it all seemed. The Great Bomb had utterly demolished the 2nd General Army Headquarters, along with Hiroshima's military supply buildings. Our troops would quickly feel the loss. Periodically my radio crackled with static, voices, and once for a minute or two the words whined distinctly. As yet, authorities have not determined the exact nature of the weapon which... New bomb of some kind. Doctors analysing the effects but still uncertain. Then an ongoing blare of static that hurt my ears, and I switched to another station. Strains coming from Light of the Firefly, the melody of Auld Lang Syne. Moments and a familiar voice interrupted. "My dear and esteemed Japanese pilots," it droned, "this is Saipan, and I am Japanese as you are. At this very moment I am safe from the horror of war, comfortable and well cared for. Are you also?" This was followed by a lengthy pause, so long that I assumed the message had ended. Then suddenly it continued. "And why, my friends, must you remain the helpless pawns of a senseless war? You gallant and noble kamikaze who daily sacrifice your lives, though now to what avail? Why must you be victimized? Why must you die when those deaths will accomplish no good whatever, when the war is all but over? America," the voice continued, "would offer but one alternative: surrender or annihilation. Do you know that your mothers, your wives, your brothers and sisters, your children, are dying by the thousands? That those who survive will soon be starving? Indeed, many are already starving. And why? Because of the enemy. Most certainly, but also because of the arrogance and selfishness of your leaders, a comparative few in Tokyo, who insist that their alleged sacred honour is more precious than the suffering and destruction of countless thousands, ere long perhaps millions of their people, of you yourselves. The voice persisted with painful and relentless logic, much like a surgical procedure without anaesthetic. Surrender for our remaining pilots would be relatively easy, it promised. We would merely need to waggle our wings upon approaching an American landing field, and the guns would remain silent. We would be given safe haven and good treatment. "I will be back on the air in 2 hours," the voice concluded. "My only concern, and that of many others who have now joined in our cause, is your welfare and happiness. The welfare and happiness of our country." Then silence, a bit of static and more music. This time, ironically, to the tune of My Old Kentucky Home, involving the early American Southland, yet also very popular throughout Japan in my own time.